Hello everyone, my name is Hannah and I'm going to teach you how to solder for paper circuits. So first off, our tools. We have this right here, which is a soldering iron. The soldering iron is basically a hot metal brand that is used to melt liquid tin in order to create a sort of molten glue that can be used to attach an LED to a piece of copper. So this is a super hot object. Everything from here down on this is dangerous to touch. From here back is safe to touch. Some general safety rules to bear in mind. First off, remember that this thing should always be in its cradle unless you're actively using it. You should never, if this was my pretend soldering iron, you should never have it out and be like gesturing, because you'll bump into things as I just did and you will hurt someone. Likewise, when you are holding the soldering iron, you're going to hold it more or less like you would hold a pencil or a pen, which is to say, these two fingers need to tuck in against your palm. That's to keep you from burning them. This finger kind of creates a crook that you're going to use to support it from underneath. The edge of the soldering iron sort of fits into this L, and you grab it with these two fingers for support. You really need to make sure that you don't have like fingers dangling down in a position where they could hit that hot bit of metal. That's super dangerous. It's a great way to hurt yourself or someone else. Other things to think about. This soldering iron reaches about 400 degrees Celsius, which is over 800 Fahrenheit. That is absolutely hot enough for you to burn yourself. If you burn yourself, what you're gonna do is first, you will put the iron back in its cradle so that no one and nothing else gets hurt. And then you're gonna make your way to a sink where you will pour cold, running water over your appendage for 10 whole minutes. Yes, 10 minutes, that entire time. It is boring, it is not pleasant, but you will do it anyway because 10 minutes is appropriate first aid for a serious burn of the kind that you would get from a soldering iron. So if you burn yourself with this, you're going under that cold running water for 10 minutes. No exceptions. Other things to note about this. 800 degrees Celsius is hot enough to melt through plastic, and you'll notice that this cable is made of plastic. You're always gonna wanna have the soldering iron set off to the side of your dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, so I try to make sure that this is on my right, and the cable goes over my right hand like this, so the cable isn't gonna be like landing into my work zone. You have to be super careful when you solder and make sure that that soldering iron never touches the cable, never touches the plastic cradle. This is a classroom soldering iron. If you look closely, you can see there are spots where this has been damaged in the past by students. Never, ever touch the plastic with the soldering iron. It will burn it. That creates really toxic fumes. It's super unpleasant. Next thing to think about in terms of safety. You want to imagine that you've got sort of a danger zone, which is whatever you could touch with that soldering iron. When you pull the soldering iron out of its cradle, you want to immediately plant the heel of your hand down on the table. What this does is by planting the heel of my hand down, I basically create a really limited zone of things that I could hit. And even if I get nudged, it's not going really far. Compare that to if my hand isn't actually anchored down. Now if I get nudged, my hand could go anywhere. It could go up. I've got a whole massive danger zone of things that I could hit if I don't have that heel of the hand anchored down on the table. So whenever you are soldering, heel of your hand is anchored down. That way there's only a limited range of things that you can hit. Now, last thing to be aware of, this thing is hot. If your hair falls on it, you will burn your hair off. This is not usually much of a health risk. I've never had anyone injure themselves doing this, but it does stink to high heaven and it will ruin your hair day and it will just look terrible. So if you have long hair like I do, you should make sure that you have it tied back and it's not gonna fall into your work zone. All right, now let's talk about this stuff. This is called solder. You can see here it says lead-free solder. You can also get this with lead in it, which is not great for your health. It is made of a type of metal, this is mostly made of tin, that basically has a relatively low melting point. So this iron gets hot enough that it will melt tin, but it will never be hot enough to melt copper, which is what we make our circuits out of. So this will never be melted, while this will be. To break off a piece of solder, you just pinch it between two fingers, and you kind of bicycle your fingers back and forth, and then metal fatigue will cause it to snap, and you'll have broken off a piece of solder. Now, the first step in soldering is I have my circuit here. So this is just copper tape on a piece of paper. You can see this is where my negative side of the battery is going to go. This is where the positive side of the battery is going to go. And basically, electrons can move from one side through the copper, then they're going to jump through a LED and make their way back to the other side. So my LEDs are going to go anywhere here where they bridge the gap between these two lines. First step in soldering is going to be to melt a blob of solder onto either side of where I want to put my LED. So I'm going to put a little blob here and a little blob here. So when I am doing this, the iron is going to take it, I'm going to take the tip and press that tip onto the copper tape. I am not going to touch the paper because when paper gets really hot, it bursts into flames. If you use good thick paper, it might just char. I have seen origami paper just spontaneously light. So please be careful. You want to touch the copper, you don't want to touch the paper. Best case scenario with touching paper is you make your project really ugly. So I'm going to take the iron, again, support it from underneath, these two fingers pinch. These two fingers are tucked in against my hand so that I know I'm not going to burn them. When I pull it out of the cradle, I immediately anchor that heel of my hand down so that my danger zone is limited. I'm going to take the tip of the soldering iron and press it onto that copper. Now in my other hand, I take my solder and I'm just going to feed it in at a nice low, wide angle towards the tip of my soldering iron. So I'm not actually putting it on top of the tip, I'm almost trying to feed it underneath it. And as I do this, at first maybe nothing happens, but once it gets hot enough, this should melt. There we go. So I just melt a nice blob of solder down there. To give you a sense of what that looks like, you can see I now have a nice blob of solder. This is actually, it's only been a few seconds, but that's actually safe to touch. The solder will freeze, by which I mean return to a solid state, immediately as soon as you pull away that iron. And this actually makes life really tricky because it means that you have to have the iron present whenever you're doing work. So there's my first blob of solder. I'm going to put another blob right across from it here. When I'm doing this, I want you to notice that I always come in with a nice low angle. So if I've got one hand, pretend this is a soldering iron here, and my other hand also is anchored down, and I come in sort of low and wide, right, towards the tip of that. The reason is I want to make sure that these fingers are too far away for my soldering iron to reach. So right now they're sort of outside of that danger zone. If I were to hold the solder like this, then my fingers are in a zone where they can easily get burned. So you come in nice and low. Both heels of both hands are anchored on the table to protect them, to keep me anchored so that I don't end up accidentally burning myself. So let me go ahead and put another blob of solder down. So again, the iron comes out of the cradle. I immediately anchor the heel of my hand down. I touch the copper itself. I take my solder and I'm going to slide it in towards the tip of the iron and just melt a blob of solder there. You'll notice I pulled this away first, and then I pull away the iron and set it in there. Now I have my two blobs of solder. So that is the easy part. Now we do the hard part. The hard part is attaching these teeny, tiny, itty-bitty LEDs. So I'm going to do my best to show you this LED. It is so, so small just the teeny tiniest. They're about 3 millimeters long. One side, it's right over here, you probably can't see it on this camera though, has a tiny little green dot. That green dot goes towards the negative side of the battery. So this is my negative line. I need to make sure that the green dot goes towards that. It's super important that I always do that. If I put it on backwards, it just won't work. So I'm gonna have to manipulate this LED with my tweezers. To pick up the LED, I take my tweezers, I sort of scooch, let me see if I can adjust this angle a bit. I scooch along. First of all, tweezers are in my non-dominant hand because I always want my dominant hand to be holding the iron. So with the heel of my hand planted down, I scooch this around and I grab it in the middle gently, right? That's with the tweezers. You'll notice the iron is in the cradle right now. It might take you a couple tries to pick up this LED. Then I'm gonna position this correctly. I'm gonna double check, yep, my green dot is towards the negative side. And I'm basically gonna hold it on top of those 2 blobs of solder. So it's in position there on top of the 2 blobs. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to remelt this first blob of solder, and while it's molten, which means while the iron is still there, still touching it, I'm gonna take my hand and just do a very slight tilt upwards to dip the ends of this LED into that molten solder. Then I'll pull away the iron and it'll freeze instantly in that position. So I take my iron out, plant that heel of my hand down, I push down into the solder until it melts. Oh, it just melted. Then I tilt to get it in position, pull away the iron, and it freezes that way. So now my LED is firmly attached down on one side, only on one side, but on this side it is connected. This side, it's still not connected yet. So the typical mistake I see with this first stage is oftentimes people will end up trying to they'll melt the solder and they'll pull away the iron and try to put the LED in position. But remember, the second you pull away that iron, the solder is gonna freeze. And then it becomes impossible to stick the LED in. So you really need to hold the iron in position while you get the LED where it needs to be. Once the LED has its ends stuck in that molten solder, that molten metal, then you can pull away the iron and let it freeze in position. Now I've got one side done over here. This side still needs to be soldered down. I never want to reach over my LED with my soldering iron. The LEDs are actually made of plastic. If you touch the LED with the iron, they'll just melt. You'll just ruin them and melt them. So rather than try to reach over the LED with my iron, I'm just gonna flip my paper around, right? Rotate it. So now the side I need to mess with is over here. It's on the side that's closer to the iron. So I take my iron out of the cradle. I plant the heel of my hand down. Again, you'll notice these fingers are tucked in. I'm not at risk of burning myself with them. I'm going to touch the iron to that blob of solder that I had already put down, and then I'm gonna take my tweezers, I'm gonna pinch them closed, and I'm gonna push on the top of the LED to sink it into position. Oh, one moment, let me remelt that solder because I pulled the iron away too fast. There we go. Sink it into position, pull away the iron so it freezes that way. Immediately when I'm done soldering, the iron goes back in its cradle. It's never removed from the cradle for any length of time. And then I have my LED soldered down. Sorry for the terrible video quality. Now, after every single LED, you really want to put the battery in position and you want to test it and just make sure that it is working. So here you can see it is indeed lighting up. The reason why you want to test it after every single LED is because if you don't, you'll end up in a situation where you find that you've put some of your LEDs on backwards. And if that happens, it will stop working. Any LED that's on backwards won't work. And it's really difficult to remove the LEDs once you've put them in place. You basically have to go through this process but backwards. So what you want to do is make sure that every LED is put on correctly. All right, that is how you solder. So key things to remember: keep the cable out of your way, keep your hair out of your way, always plant those heels of your hand down, come in at a nice low angle. Think about the danger zone of this instrument. It is super hot. Make sure that there's nothing in that zone that somebody could hurt themselves on. If you do burn yourself, even if you think, oh, that wasn't so bad, that wasn't bad at all, I'm fine, put the iron back in the cradle so nobody else gets burned, move to a sink, turn it on, put your appendage under that cold running water. It's gonna have to stay there for 10 minutes. And once you're under that water, then send somebody to let your teacher know that you've hurt yourself. All right, good luck, folks.